Hello, I'm Ellie Witter with the Miami University Alumni Association, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual Alumni Weekend, connecting Miamians all across the country and celebrating you, our alumni. Tonight, we have an alumni favorite, our wine tasting with Jack Keegan. Jack is a certified wine educator, and among his many talents, he may be best known for teaching the wines class for more than 25 years at Miami, and into his retirement, Jack continues to bring his love of wines to all Miamians. For tonight, he has curated a varietal tasting with a Spanish flair for everyone to enjoy. Please remember, you can submit questions throughout with the link just below the screen. And with that, I'll let you get started.
Thanks, Ellie, and welcome everyone. It really, probably one of the nicest things about doing this is I have talked to a number of friends, and former students who are getting ready to enjoy this with me. And just knowing that you're on the other side of the screen really sort of makes my evening. It really is great to have heard from so many people with you. The first thing is I wanted to do, as usual, is give you the list of wines. Sometimes it's hard to see if you don't have it there. So again, we're going to start, of course, with the whites, the 20 Stoneleigh from New Zealand. And then the alternative, which was available on wine.com, is the infamous Goose from New Zealand also. And then the next wine, of course, is the Crios de Susana Balbo Torrontes, which is the grape variety, as we'll talk about. And then the Ontanon Clarete, which I guess is very sort of special and very interesting from Rioja. And then going back to Susana Balbo, her signature Malbec, which is basically Argentina's signature grape. And then we're going to Australia, staying in the Southern Hemisphere with the Torbreck Woodcutters Shiraz. And then one of my favorites, and I really think just an absolutely outstanding Cabernet, is the Mount Veeder from Napa Valley. Again, we're going to go to New Zealand first. Again, this is a wine tasting, but you're not in class, so you don't have to listen to me for a couple hours before I make you taste. And so we're going to start tasting right away with this. New Zealand's an amazing country. It has amazing history with it also. I always very often I say in class, it's sort of like a upside down Italy with a hole in the middle, as you can see. And of course, the further south you go, the cooler it gets in there. And so there's a number of areas. And as we'll talk about, Sauvignon Blanc is the grape, though Pinot Noir is coming up also. The wine we're having, in fact, is from Marlborough. It's from the Warrell Valley, right there, as you can see it come up. And of course, I've got some great pictures of it. But the first wine we're going to have tonight, and we'll talk about, is the Stoneleigh from New Zealand. And this, in fact, is some of their propaganda. As you can see, vegan certified, 100% sustainable wine, under sustainable growers, all these things. It's actually the #1 wine brand in New Zealand, which is truly amazing, founded in 1980. By the way, all of the whites today come with a screw cap. And this, in fact, has a screw cap, which is perfectly fine. Actually, the New Zealanders were probably on the forefront of using screw caps because they were having so much trouble with their whites with having a wine that's corked. In other words, being infected with TCA. So that's the problem. Sauvignon Blanc is the signature grape of New Zealand. Probably, if I remember rightly, like 57% of all of the grapes in New Zealand that are done are in fact from Sauvignon Blanc. So again, as you can see, a very, very pale color here. And actually mine has a little bit of spritz to it. Now, of course, this is 2020. And so you may find probably a little bit of carbon dioxide still left in your glass, as mine has, just a little bit of it. The French would call it pétillance, which is sort of the fancy word for that. And again, nice light, we typically call them pale straw, beautiful color. And again, if you swirl and smell this wine, it's just hilarious. It screams New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, there are a few other wines that are as identifiable in the world as New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. It has that mango, grapefruit, sometimes a little jalapeno, just really wonderful fruit that just jumps right out of the glass. It's just amazing. Oh, yeah, a little bit of lime too, but I really am getting sort of mango and guava, lots of tropical fruits. Guava, no question. And again, if you taste this wine, talk about a wonderful aperitif, wonderful stony minerality. nice, almost dries in the mouth, just really nicely, really cleanly. Right away, I could see having this with something made out of goat cheese. First thing, right off the bat. I think it would be really good with shrimp and all kinds of things like that, seafood, because it's just so fresh and so stony. Just so tasty. A little bit more about this wine. Again, this is, in fact, what the River Valley looks like. I've always wanted to go to New Zealand, even before Lord of the Rings came out with all the pictures of New Zealand. I just think it's an amazing country and really like to. Interestingly enough, New Zealand was also the country that almost had prohibition also. It was only the doughboys coming back from World War I who voted against it, since obviously they had A, been in war, and B, been in Europe. And so, but they had a very, very strict control for a long time. And then finally, they realized about wine tourism, et cetera. And so now it's a very open country. And of course, their acreage has increased a fair amount. Look at this valley. Isn't it amazing? The other thing I want you to notice on this picture is look at the windbreaks in between. A lot of New Zealand is in the roaring 40s, which means they have a lot of wind. And it doesn't take much wind for a grapevine to shut down, actually most plants. And so consequently, having those windbreaks are very important in keeping the vines productive, etc. And you can see, of course, all the sedimentation coming off of that river. It's just sort of amazing, in fact, to see with all of that. This is the grape. This is Sauvignon Blanc, which, as I said, is by far the signature grape of New Zealand in there. Look at the, I almost hate to call it soil. Look at the stoniness of that soil, because again, you are very much in an alluvial soil. The wonderful thing about this soil is, it sort of seems odd to say, it's bad. It is rotten soil. It is not, it doesn't have a lot of minerals in it. It doesn't have a lot of fertilizer in it. And so consequently, that's what grapes do best in. They have to have everything, but if you give them too much, they won't do well. And so having this kind of lean soil, I think is probably the best word for it, is really, really important with it. I just love these pictures, in fact, that they had on their website of the stones in between with this. And of course, again, when the sun comes up, it's just so beautiful on this flat land right there in the River Valley. So just really, really neat to see. A wonderful, wonderful place, be a great place to visit. And this, of course, is the owner and winemaker who has been, in fact, there since about 1980. So pretty amazing place to see, and really just a beautiful wine, and you can see why it is that way. As I said, it's gently pressed, clarified, cool fermentation. Each tank then separately is evaluated, then blended. Alcohol is fairly low, 13%. Residual sugar, 4.8 grams per liter, which is way below what you can taste. And acidity fairly high, so very, very nice. And again, I like this quality price ratio. That's what QPR means. Bursting with, as they say, passion fruit, grapefruit, gooseberry, green aspect. Lots of weight, acidity keeps it fresh and lively. Explodes out of the glass, no question. This is truly a textbook example of a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And so if it's a wine you like, and they really are wonderful. Sauvignon Blanc is such an interesting grape because if you get it out of the Loire, it tastes differently. Obviously, if you get it out of California, it's going to be juicier and rounder and softer, but also very good. And then, of course, I was just seeing about trends. White Bordeaux's are made from Sauvignon Blanc and, of course, typically Semillon and a little Muscadel in them, and are just really, really good for that. And so Sauvignon Blanc is one of those grapes that just gives you endless variety. And so really very nice from that standpoint. I'm going to take a minute and talk about the infamous Goose. This is actually a moa, which is, in fact, was a flightless bird that basically went extinct, unfortunately, not a long time ago. And so this is what the name comes from, for the infamous Goose in there. And again, those of you who got this on wine.com, that's one interesting thing for me, too, is to take two different ones from, in fact, the same year. In fact, this is also from Marlborough, but not exactly the same area with this. So again, same wonderful color, maybe actually a little bit less yellow, even clearer than the first wine. And this wine is more subdued. It's gentler. It has less of that in-your-face Sauvignon Blanc character to it. Oh yeah, it really comes out much, much softer, really pretty. But and it's like Sauvignon Blanc has been tamed a bit, where the other one was a bit wilder in that. Again, beautiful, beautiful, nice fruit flavors. A little bit of grapefruit, but again, not real strong. Yes. It's a little rounder. It's a little softer, even though there's very good acidity there. And it has really nice fruit. It's nothing against it. It's just not as distinctive as the Stoneleigh is, and really shows almost a little bit more California character than New Zealand character with this, but still a very, very nice wine. These are pictures from their website. As you can see, in fact, they have that stony soil also. Picked optimal ripeness, destem, free run juice in the same way. 3 months of aging, and that's what softens it out. It's 3 months on the lees, and that's, of course, means the yeast that's left, and that typically softens and rounds a wine. As they say, in fact, it provides body and complexity to the wine. And so that's what you're seeing. You're seeing a rounder expression of Sauvignon Blanc from this wine. So it's sort of interesting to do that. But I thought it's always important to give you something to taste while we're talking about some of the various things that are going on with everything. Here, of course, the technical data, as you can see, acidity, in fact, every bit as high, pH about the same, alcohol exactly the same, 3 months in stainless. But of course, I think the lees aging make a difference on this wine. Very, very nice. Again, this got 91 for the tasting panel. The nose is linear and bright white, excludes a complex perfume of gooseberry, starfruit, and chaparral. Crisp flavors of grapefruit and kiwi are clean and dotted with tarragon and dill. So sort of a nice savoriness to this wine. Both really nice examples of Sauvignon Blanc. Just to, it's really nice to see those differently. And I know, unfortunately, most of you don't have either one or the other, but it is sort of fun to think about the various expressions that you can get out of Sauvignon Blanc with that. Okay. So one of the reasons I gave you this wine is get to talk to you a little bit, as I always do, about what's happening in the world of wine. Certainly, it's been a real problem with our with the 25% tariff that was put on a couple of years ago with wines coming from Europe. And that has caused tremendous consternation both here in America and in Europe, because, again, it made it very difficult for a lot of importers with everything going on. But as of July 11th is the day the negotiators are aiming to permanently remove the 25% tariff. It has been removed, but they're still, of course, in negotiations about what's going to happen. And hopefully everyone, I think, in the wine world hopes on both sides of the Atlantic that, in fact, they will be gone on July 11th. Rosé continues to be a hot category. It was interesting. La Vie Ferme is just a very good everyday wines. Their whites, their rosés, etc. These are probably less than $10 a bottle, but their rosé was up 22% this year, which is just amazing. It continues to be a really hot category. And again, if you go into a wine shop, you will see 30 different rosés without much difficulty at all if it's a good sized wine shop with this. This is part of the problem. As all of you know, in fact, I was reading an article today about how Starbucks can't get some of their ingredients and how difficult it is. It now costs over $10,000 to send a container on a ship from Asia to Europe. That's up 485% from a year ago. And so you understand not only wine is why all of our, the sort of supply chain is a disaster going on. And so it really, though, affects wine tremendously because they really need to come, of course, in containers and typically refrigerated. Again, Mother Nature always tells you something. Hail damaged thousands of acres in both Vouvray and the Ribera del Duero, so in France and Spain recently, which is always a problem. You always have to look at the sky and check what's going on. The other thing, again, maybe in fact could be a good thing for some people, to-go alcohol is now allowed in 39 states. Again, this is, of course, as an outcome from COVID, and many of these places are now have them permanently. And I think eventually it probably will be this way. And so you can, of course, get a drink. And of course, is it Dora? It's Dora, where in fact you can actually, in fact, Oxford has them from time to time, where you can actually have a drink and walk from shop to shop or restaurant to restaurant. So it's sort of interesting to see how COVID has, in fact, changed our lives in the world of wine. So we will continue our next wine. I guess first, Emily, are there any questions?
Yes, we do have a question. With the first one, the question was, how does a Sauvignon compare to a Chardonnay? The viewer thought it reminded them of a Chardonnay, the first one that we tried.
Well, I would say the thing is, and if it reminded them of Chardonnay, it would be, in fact, probably a crisp, unoaked Chardonnay, or even maybe a little bit of a Chablis, because none of those see oak. Your typical Chardonnay sees oak. And so it tends to be softer and rounder. And so with this wine, it would be, if you like a Chardonnay that's really nice and crisp and young, or as I said, Chablis is a good example of this, where they don't use any oak in the wine. And so then it may still have some of those characteristics, especially with the acidity that you can get in a good young Chardonnay. Okay. Anything else?
One more question, and actually you kind of were already going with the oak, of why stainless steel tanks instead of wood tanks?
Very good question. Well, for one thing, the thing about stainless steel is, and this is something I did not mention, they sort of mentioned it in passing, is that almost all of these stainless steel tanks are jacketed, meaning that they are refrigerated. Because when you are making a white wine, you want to typically vinify them at like 60 degrees or so. In other words, a good, cool, slow fermentation, because then you keep the more delicate aromas that you will find in a white wine. And so typically when we do a white wine, we are going to do it at 55, 60, 65 degrees for that reason. So it's a lot easier to maintain the temperature in a jacketed stainless steel. Also, stainless steel doesn't give any flavors. The wonderful thing about oak is that it does two things. Obviously, if it's new oak, it gives oak flavoring. And again, Chardonnay is about the only, but you will occasionally see Sauvignon Blanc with a little bit of oak aging to it. The other thing it does is what's called micro-oxygenation, which means it softens the wines and change it. And when you want a real crisp style like you get from New Zealand, that is in fact what you're looking for. And so you would really tend to do this in stainless steel more than anything else. Or it could be a cement tank that's lined with glass, or a number of different things, but typically an inert tank is what you would use. Okay. Anything else?
I think we can go on to the next one.
Well, then we're off to Argentina. And again, though, the area, of course, you see this beautiful picture. The wine that we're having is from Susana Balbo for two reasons. Actually, three. First and foremost, she makes wonderful wines. There is no question about it. And again, she, and being a woman winemaker, I thought it was really nice to sort of bring this in, sort of some inclusivity with this too. It's interesting. This is one of the labels, and the other, as you have probably in your hand, in fact, is the different label. And this grape is one that there's a good chance you may have never heard of, and that is Torrontes. And we will talk a little bit about it in a moment with this. But first, let's taste this wine. Okay. First of all, again, you see, same very, very, in fact, literally very, very pale yellow, almost no color at all. And that part of that has to do, of course, with the grape variety, and also, again, how it's made. Stainless steel, all of these things in the same manner with this. Now, again, if you swirl and smell this wine, I'm trying to think what it reminds me of. It almost reminds me, in fact, there used to be, again, I'm certainly showing my age. It reminds me a little gingery. And there was a gum that was called Fantan that had this exact same aroma to it, which is just sort of crazy to think about. That's what it reminds me of in there, because it's very fruity. It's almost like tutti frutti. It's really really bright in there. Oh yeah, and maybe some chamomile, but certainly really nice bright fruit. A little Moscato sort of aroma to it too. It has that muscat aroma, even though this is not muscat. This is in fact Torrontes, as we will see. As it says, dry, crisp, aromatic. And if you taste this wine, nice and dry, has that sort of chalky minerality to it that's also really nice on the palate, really clean, really bright there. So just so tasty. A little bit of pineapple, but again, has a nice savory note to it that makes it really very, very nice, sort of tropical fruits again in there. Of course, This is from Argentina. Argentina, by the way, is by far the largest wine producer in South America. We see as much or more Chilean wines because they are much more into exports. The Argentines, in fact, for a very long time, drank pretty much everything they made. And of course, part of it was, in fact, looking for hard currency. And that's a very interesting history with this. This, of course, is Susana Balbo. By the way, Crios is basically offspring or children. And so these, she sort of looks at the wines as her children, but these, in fact, are her children. And so this is another reason why, in fact, she makes these wines for that. So I thought that was sort of neat to see. And this, of course, is the winery. I want to go. Can we all go? Come on, let's get a group together. I think we need to go and visit here. I mean, it's just glorious to see. I mean, it's just like, wow, those mountains are just amazing to see. Here again, a lot of picture, maybe a little more prosaic of the vineyards themselves there on the side. And so very nice in the vineyards. This is Torrontes. Torrontes is Argentina's only native grape. And actually, I'll be honest, I learned this as I was working on this. And it's because it is a cross between Criollo, which in fact was our California mission grape, and actually, again, it's wonderful how much you can learn. There are actually 3 different kinds of Torrontes. All 3 have the same parentage, but were in fact probably brought up independently. And so it really is, in fact, a cross with the mission grape, and I think it was a Muscat of Alexandria in there. And so it really is, in fact, a native to Argentina. So you'd have to get the grapes from there if you wanted to grow it someplace else. And it is so refreshing, so nice. It's 100% Torrontes. Look at this too. The grapes come from 2 different areas. Salta, which is very up in the north, and then the Uco Valley, probably one of the most important areas in Mendoza. We'll talk a little bit more about later. And the elevation of these grapes, the vineyards go up to 5,577 feet above sea level. I mean, most of the, let's face it, most of the atmosphere is below that. And so they just get tremendous amounts of sunlight up there. And in fact, in many cases, they have to worry about hailstorms from the Andes. Hand harvested. See that cool fermentation? Vinification, 55%, select yeast. 3 months on the lees, again, to give it a little bit of roundness in that wine also. And they say, yes, passion fruit, no question. Bouquet of citrus fruits, passion fruit, lychees, and white flowers, lively city, hint of creaminess. And it says pair with smoked meats, medium cheeses, fish, crab, or sushi. It got 91 points from suckling, medium tangy, sliced apples and lemon skin, hints of stone and concrete. Again, that stone and concrete, that's that wonderful sort of chalky kind of minerality that's in the finish. Medium bodied, clean and fresh, lots of citrus. 90 from Parker. Bit reductive, influence of sulfur in the bottling, underneath notes of white peach and some citrus, of course, orange blossom and muscatel pulp with sensations. Again, they make a lot of it, 324,000 bottles. And as you can see, as most of you probably in fact purchased these, not expensive and still just a great, great summertime wine. Really fun from that standpoint in there. Okay. Oh, just good. So pretty. So another thing I very often do is I know, again, especially with COVID, et cetera, you have not been able to come to campus. And so I thought I'd show you a couple things that have been going on. This, of course, is the plaza that is in memory of the Miamians who passed away at the service of their country. And so I will be honest, this is the first time actually I went down to see it myself this morning. And I was looking at the names, and it's funny, many of you know I sang with the Glee Club for many years, and I happened to see the second name, which was Joel Battle. And in fact, I had to check with a friend of mine who is, in fact, belongs to Beta Theta Pi, and say, do you know the story of Joel Battle? Joel obviously was a student here at Miami. And of course, he, as the Civil War came, many people, of course, separated for the war. Some, of course, went south, others went north. Joel went south. And in fact, he was killed at the Battle of Shiloh. And his father was out looking for his body. And here was a fellow Beta who, in fact, was one of his brothers who found the body and, in fact, buried it privately under a big oak tree at the Battle of Shiloh. So it's really a wonderful piece of brotherhood with Miami. I've always been amazed by that story. So again, it's really a nice extra piece on our campus to have there in there. This, of course, is where we would have been if you had been here, if we had Alumni Weekend as normal. As you can see here, again, that's looking back. The plants are doing very well. We've had tons of rain and tons of humidity here, so everything is extremely green. Let's just look back here at Krieger. And of course, looking down at the lawn where we typically, in fact, have many of the things that are going on there. I swear I was not drinking when I took this picture. After I got it, I thought, whoa, there's a little bit of an angle there. It's like, gee, too bad in there. But again, you're missing the cicada apocalypse. As you can see on top of this service drive, there are, in fact, 2 cicadas. I'm not sure if you can see all of those flying around there. So it's probably a good thing that you're not on campus right now, because they truly are amazing. I see this. I love this. I figured this cicada wanted to get lucky, and so again was probably trying to rub the turtle's head there. So I thought that was just too hilarious to see things there on campus today. So I thought I'd give you a few things about what's happening on campus at the moment. Okay. So considering on with Spain, we are going to go to Spain, or España. And again, Spain has the largest acreage of grapes in the world, more than any other country. But it's third in production because much of Spain is, in fact, a semi-desert. And so their yields are very, very low. For those of you who took the class from John Dome, Geography of Wine, when he gave you a map of Spain, he had on there Rioja, which we will talk about. He also had the Penedès, which is up there, as you can see, Tarragona, up there, not far from Barcelona. And I think he might have had the Valdepeñas. There are 3, or certainly, of course, Jerez Sherry at the bottom. And that was it. Look at the map today. It is amazing to see how Spain has, again, gone back to all of these wine regions, is making wine, and it's constantly like, never heard of that area. Never heard of that area. And it continues that way. In fact, there are a few places on here I still have never had wine from, like Mentrida. I have, but Rueda, Toro, Chocolate, Navarra, again, so many places make so many good wines. Many of them great summertime wines, very often good barbecue wines, and typically not very expensive for some of them. Though, of course, some can be very expensive in all of that. So the wine that we're having is always been one of my favorites. This is from Ontanon. This is Clarete. Now, typically, if you were to get a rosé from Spain, and they make wonderful ones, they would call it a rosado. And typically, but this, as you can see, it has its own name, which is typical of Rioja. And also because this is a blend of white and red grapes. And you're not allowed to do that in Europe to make a rosé. Typically, you have to use red grapes and only allow them a short amount of skin contact to get the color. Because remember, only the skins have color in a grape. So if you peel off the skin of a grape, the juice is clear. The inside is clear. And so if you want to make a white wine out of red grapes, all you have to do is crush them immediately and don't allow any skin contact, which is, by the way, how they make champagne. But if you want some color, you leave it for a couple hours, as they very often will, or a few hours. And of course, the longer you leave it, the darker it gets. And of course, to make a red wine, you leave it in there for days, and that's how you get the wine to be red. So this is Ontanon Clarete. Again, beautiful color. By the way, it might be another thing that you've noticed about rosés is that they're lighter than they used to be. Now, let me back up a bit. If you had the only rosés, of course, you could originally get, especially from France, was Tavel. And it, in fact, was very much this color, or even younger, or even lighter. They almost call it onion skin, or almost all skin tone kind of thing, a very, very, very light pink. But as more people began making rosés, you'll see them darker. Some of them, in fact, almost as dark as a Pinot Noir. But more and more, I find that people are going to these extremely light ones. And as I said, an extremely hot category. So again, I know, shut up, Jack. Let's taste the wine. And again, beautiful color. A little bit of that, the French would call eye of the partridge. It's just that very, very slight almost a slight tinge of, it's really not pink, it's sort of orangey in a way. That's sort of very, very, really very lovely. And again, if you swirl and smell this wine, I just think this wine is just lovely. It's a little smoky. It has a little bit of orange to it. Very, very fresh, very light. Yum. I love this wine. It was a no-brainer to add this one to the list because I've always liked this wine. And again, if you taste it, strawberries. And in fact, the nose, as I was taking it to my nose, I almost wanted to say I sort of have wine Tourette's, that I wanted to, because again, it was like, oh, the strawberries hit me as I was putting it to my mouth. So to me, this is so much what a rosé should be. Bright, it's perfectly dry, but it has just this wonderful fruit. And I can think of so many things it can go with. I mean, certainly a number of cheeses. You could certainly do this. I really think it has enough body that you could even do like grilled chicken or something like that. I think that you could have without any problem. But all kinds of salads, certainly ham, anything like this, summertime wine, charcuterie, all that stuff would just go so well with this wine. This wine is just, to me, it's a wonder because it's so relatively inexpensive and so tasty. Just beautiful. Has that nice savory note to it also. Yum. Just delicious. Again, this is where La Rioja is. And as you can see, in fact, all the various areas. So it's up there in the north. Actually, interesting. I should have put in a picture with a topographical map, because just north of there are the Sierra Cantabrias, in other words, the mountains. And so what La Rioja is actually in a rain shield or rain shadow, meaning that it is relatively dry. And it's also the higher elevations that, in fact, typically give you the best wines. This, of course, is a map. It's interesting, if any of you know Rioja at all, it wasn't only a few years ago that you can see, of course, Rioja Alta, of course, meaning high, and it's closest to the Sierra Cantabrias, the mountains that are there. In fact, Aro, which is there up at the top, is sort of the main city, but this wine is actually from Lagorno, as you can see also in La Rioja Alta. And then, of course, you have Alavesa, but that's only because it's again, across the river, it's in a different province, Alava, and so that's why it's Alavesa. And then, of course, south of there, you have Rioja Oriental. Oriental, of course, means easterly, is what they mean there, because, in fact, up until 4 years ago, this was Rioja Baja, meaning lower Rioja. But Baja just has a sort of a negative connotation, so they got rid of the Baja and they changed it to Oriental, which I thought was sort of funny with that. But that's exactly, in fact, what they did in there. And so this is, in fact, the zones of Rioja. By the way, I should mention, you see it's a DOCA, and that's the last word is calificada, meaning that the wine, there are only 2 regions that have sort of the best of the best of Spain, the other one being the Priorat. And so this is, in fact, Rioja being one of them. This is Ontanon. This is their area. They have, in fact, obviously a very modern place and a museum there. In fact, you can see, of course, the bodega and the museum that is at Ontanon. That is there with it. Here, of course, is part of their vineyards. You can see how dry, and you see when you see all these pictures, just the lack of, there's no woods, there's no trees, and really that's true of so much of Spain in these areas. Again, this is another picture of Ontanon's vineyards up in that area. Absolutely beautiful, but you can see, in fact, just gorgeous, sort of stark countryside, which, of course, all of those grapes on there. Again, pictures from their thing. Actually, a beautiful picture showing you the trunk, the arms, or the cordon, which is the long part that goes horizontally. And then, of course, how many years this is done with, in fact, the 2 bud canes, and so the new growth coming off of that. This, of course, is taken after harvest. And so that's why you don't see any grapes on this. And so the grapes, of course, are turning in for the winter. But a very good example of how grapes throughout the world are pruned in that manner in there. As you see, Clarete is a unique Riojan style rosé because it's pressed off of grapes. Minimal skin content, a blend of white, which is Viura, and red Tempranillo, which is the national grape, their most common grape, or not their most common, but their most celebrated grape, I would say. They're co-fermented. And so this is, as he says, lighter, almost Provençal style rosé. Rich tradition in there. It's destemmed, crushed, goes into stainless steel as usual. Tempranillo goes the same process and add to the same tank as the Viura. So you have co-fermentation. They're fermented together. And only, of course, for a short period of time. And actually, probably very little Tempranillo because it goes for 11 days. Then quick fermentation, fresh and fruity character. Then racking on lees for a month, very short time with a little mouthfeel, and then clarified and filtered before bottling. So again, I could find nothing on this wine, which is a shame. This wine is just, I think, delicious. Yeah, in fact, even as it warms up a little bit, it really just opens up even more. Any questions, Emily? Oops, sorry about that, Ellie.
No worries at all. Absolutely. We do have a couple questions.
And I haven't drinking that much. You can watch me.
One person said that the Clarete was hard to find. Is that typical?
Unfortunately, yes. And that's why I said any Clarete would do when I sent it out. Because, and I don't understand why. Actually, that really is a good point that makes me think, because Rioja has gone through, I'll back up a little further. Rioja was basically the number one wine region of Spain, no question. And it was that way because when phylloxera, which was that insect which attacked the French vineyards, the French had to do something to get wine. And so they went to Rioja and basically built a wine culture. And so they were shipping literally millions of gallons of wine from Spain to France every month during the 1880s. In other words, when phylloxera was a real problem with this. And so this gave Rioja the foundation for this. After Franco disappeared, etc., Rioja was basically in the driver's seat. They were as I said, the most important region in Spain. And they sort of rested on their laurels a bit. They sat back and thought, we don't have to do anything. Well, then, of course, Ribera del Duero, the Priorat, all these other areas came up and said, wait, we make great wines, etc. And so the people in Rioja have had to do some changing. And one of the things that they've done is, in fact, allowed more white grapes to be grown, and in fact, making wines like this. It's funny, and I'm not sure. I don't think there's any. The words aren't the same. In Italy, I will tell you another wine to look for, a rosé. It's called Charetto, Chairetto, if I'm not mistaken, Chairtto. I can't remember if the R is in there or not, or the I is in there or not, but it is. And these wines are just delicious, and they are, in fact, made in the same manner as this. I think you're going to see a lot more Claretes on the market, again, because of the interest in rosé. And as I said, especially, I know, of course, this is in the Cincinnati area and should be available. I'd have to check and see. I tried to make sure it was throughout Ohio, but it is really a really lovely wine, this Ontanon. I apologize if it is difficult, in fact, to find it. Anything else?
Yeah, so actually, if we can go back to Argentina for a moment, Lori said that it was great to include a female vintner. How many female vintners are there around the world?
Whoa, that is a great question. And I would be shocked if it was more than 5%. Again, and what's great is actually along those lines, I will tell you, in fact, they just did the Napa Valley every year has a big, what I'm trying to say, it's Premier Napa Valley. And so it's an auction. And in fact, it was really nice to see that the second highest bid was, in fact, for a lot of wines that was made by 4 female winemakers. One of them, I happen to say, happens to be a favorite of mine, and that is Kathy Corazon. If I could afford Corazon wines, I would buy them all the time. As Kathy said, she had to be in the business for 30 years before she became an overnight sensation. And in fact, she makes probably some of the best wines in Napa Valley. So it's really great that, in fact, that again, female, I think of Donnie Dwyer, I think of Zelma Long, a number of people. In fact, it was interesting. I just, one of my students is now the assistant winemaker at Stoller. And in fact, I just watched a tasting with their winemaker. And she is also, in fact, Kate is also obviously a female winemaker, and it was great to listen to her also. So it is becoming more inclusive. But like with everything else, it's unfortunately takes time with all of that. But that's a good question. Anything else?
I think this last one's going to be a little bit in jest. But what wine pairs with cicadas?
Wow. The thing is, and I actually sort of feel badly that I haven't tasted them, and I haven't tasted them. But I've been told that they taste sort of like lobster. So I would think if you could use a good buttery Chardonnay, at least something to drink that you'd enjoy while you're having the cicadas. So that's what I would probably try. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's go back to Argentina, shall we? And again, with this, etc. And of course, the wine that we are trying is from Susana Balbo, and this is her signature Malbec. Now, this is, in fact, it's her signature Malbec, but there's no question, even though, of course, they grow many different grapes in Argentina. But Malbec is really their signature. Now, Malbec, again, practically like every grape except for like Torrontes, is in fact a French grape. And in fact, it was grown in very small amounts in Bordeaux. It was also mainly grown in an area that we're starting to see a little bit of this wine in America now, again, is Cahors, Cahors. And so in Cahors, they in fact also make Malbec. But typically you will find Malbec in but usually like a percent or two in some blends out of Bordeaux still today. But it was taken to Argentina. It likes the high elevations. It needs a lot of time to ripen, which of course it does in Argentina. And so it has become their signature grape in all of this. As you can see, this was in fact it with a cork. And so let me pour this wine. And again, very dark in color. I like putting it against a white background, and you can see, and even though this is 17, if I'm not mistaken, it is in fact very, very garnet in color. Still has a really wonderful red, and wow, I mean, what a nose. I mean, it's not obviously close to my nose, as you can see, and I'm already smelling this wine. It really is quite nice from that. Really just sort of leaps out of the glass at you. So again, let's swirl and smell this wine. Sort of blueberries and very dark. Those are elderberries too. Wonderful fruit. Also a little bit of almost like a brown sugarish aroma to it. Really nice dark fruit. And a little bit of smokiness. Wow. And again, if you taste this wine, that's a mouthful of wine. There is no question about that. Tremendous fruit, very silky in the mouth, which is really nice. But what's really good about it is, even though you have all that fruit, in the finish, you have the tannins. It gets nice and dark and rich. It's certainly far from over tannic, but it really just has a wonderful balance to it, which is really, really, really pretty. Oh, yes. Oh, and it almost has a not quite mintiness, but it has a little bit of that spiciness to it also. So nice. Again, these are the wine regions of Argentina. You saw the picture previously. This shows you, of course, Salta, as I mentioned, is all the way to the far north. And then, of course, you see Mendoza, which is sort of the middle large orange area. And, of course, with the various parts. And then below that, or within Mendoza, I think I have a picture here. Yes, you have the Uco Valley, which is there, maximum elevation of 4,700 feet. And so it is the highest area and is probably it's become sort of the Napa of Mendoza. I mean, this is where people go. This is where some of the best wineries are, in fact, in the Uco Valley. By the way, in fact, I'm glad they show this too, because we talked about the Torrontes, where part of it is made from Uco, the other is made from Salta. And you see Salta is 847 miles away. And so obviously they have to ship this wine a fair distance if they're doing blending down there to do that. So I thought that was good, in fact, to see with this. Again, you can see this won a silver medal in the Decanter Wine Awards. This, of course, another picture of Susana Balbo. Again, very, very proud of the work that she does down there. And of course, this is Malbec grapes that you can see there for her wine. As you can see, destemmed, lightly crushed, pumping over and delestage. Delestage means that they take away the seeds so that they're trying to reduce the amount of tannin that is there. So delestage 3 times a day. Maximum temperature, again, you see before, we're talking 10, 12 degrees centigrade. Now we're up to 28 degrees centigrade. In other words, like 85, 87, 88, 90 degrees in temperature, because you get a lot more of the color and flavors out of the grape skins at a higher temperature. And then after the fermentation is done, they let it sit on the skins for 35 days. That's what extended maceration means. And what that does is that typically sort of helps to sort of integrate the flavors together. Aged for 13 months in 30% new oak barrels, and you certainly get it, but boy, there's so much fruit. You really don't, the oak is far from overpowering. The 70% second use, meaning that it provides a lot of the micro-oxygenation, but not a lot of the flavor in those second use barrels. In fact, a lot of people prefer wines out of second use barrels. Really a beautiful example of Malbec. And not only did I think so, but look at this. 94 points from Tim Atkins. Reds are dramatic upward curve, demonstrated subtle, beautifully rain. Malbec with 66% Cabernet. Mineral and fresh, understated oak and bags of blueberry and black cherry fruit. And 92 from Parker. Spicy, smoky aromas, as I mentioned. Matured in oak barrels. 13 months, comes from Altamira, some 6% Cabernet, note of ripe berries, blackberries, and a touch of toast, has the flavors of creamy oak, herbs, and ripe fruit. They'll be lowering the oak in this range, but still oakier than the Ben Marco range in there. But yeah, and it is. Obviously, there's oak there, but it's in the finish. It certainly is not overpowering at all. And 92 from Parker for this wine. Quality price ratio is through the roof. Questions, Ellie?
Yes. So how long have both New Zealand and Argentina been in the wine business?
Good question. What was the first place?
New Zealand.
Oh, New Zealand, actually, that's very good, because actually New Zealand, let's see, this is 2021. I would say 30 years ago, there probably weren't even 10,000 acres of vineyards in New Zealand at that point in time. Again, they were very repressive. They were very much anti-alcohol. And so it really was not until the 80s and 90s that they finally realized that they could grow great wines, make great wines, grow great grapes. And so that has changed tremendously. In fact, even I've been surprised, as I teach the course and I update my numbers, again, just to sort of give these students an idea about where things come from, as how much it has come. Now, Argentina is sort of the exact opposite. Again, when the Argentines came, and of course mainly Europeans coming, of course there were some indigenous out there, sort of part of the Inca, etc. What they did was they took over, in fact, a lot of the water systems that, in fact, the Incas had done up in the mountains, and again, because it was a Catholic country, they needed to grow grapes to make wine for mass. And so it was important from that standpoint. But there was not much growth, or there was not a tremendous amount of acreage until the railroad came in to Mendoza from Buenos Aires. And when they could do that, then of course that caused a tremendous increase. Of course, as you may or may not know, if you follow the world, I mean, at one point, Argentina was like the 8th richest country in the world, and in fact was extremely European. In fact, actually, the president of Argentina, I don't know if you saw that, but the president of Argentina got into major hot water, I think yesterday, for making a comment that was, let's say, inept at best, talking about those kinds of things. You can look it up, in fact, quite easily from that. But it was very European. And so because, especially with the great trade ships, people went to Argentina, which is why the tango, swept through all of Europe in the 20s. But again, of course, you had all the problems between the wars, and then, of course, the whole difficulties with their government, etc. So it's been bad. And they grew a lot of really bad grapes, but when their economy collapsed, they needed hard currency, and they turned to wine. And so shipping out Malbec, etc., plus, of course, their other agricultural products was, in fact, how they came back. So they've been doing it for a long time, but they really have increased and certainly have sort of gotten into their stride only in maybe probably the last 15 years. Okay? Anything else?
Yes, another one has come through from Amanda. When you say new barrels, what does that mean? Is it brand new barrels for each batch, and what happens to the old ones?
That's a great question. And actually, yes. In other words, so for this wine, 30% of the wine were in brand new barrels. They had never been used before. And again, I always do the thing that people mainly understand is tea bags. When you use a tea bag the first time, of course, you're going to get most of the color and flavor out of it. When you use it the second time, of course, it's going to be much lighter, and you're not going to get a whole lot out of it. Well, it's true for barrels, but the thing with barrels is barrels do two things. One, they give flavor. And at the same time, the flavor from a barrel, those oak flavors, should be a spice. It's like adding pepper or salt or some other herb to a dish. You don't want to overpower it. You just want to enhance the dish. And that's what you do with oak. You just want enough to enhance the flavors that are there and not overpower it. And so this is why, depending on how big or powerful the wine is, will then dictate to a good winemaker how much oak he wants to add. And so that's why you see that 30-70, because under the 70% that they used, it will have some oak flavor, but it still gives you that critical micro-oxygenation, which softens the wine, it rounds the wine, it makes it more drinkable, especially because it softens the tannins that are there. Typically, and again, you have to think about it, especially the big boys, they probably use, by about the third passage, you're probably getting little to no oak flavor, but you're still getting the micro-oxygenation. And so in many cases, they will probably use, again, depending on the winery, depending on how expensive the wine is, depending on, because if they have a $50 wine, then a $20 wine, then a $10 wine, they may use it 5 times before then they will sell it off for something else. And so typically a barrel can be used 5 times without any difficulty, especially in one of the bigger places that would use them, like a Gallo or a Mondavi or somebody like that. Okay? Questions?
Yes, switching gears a little bit. Do you know if the cicadas have caused any problems for the vineyards here in the Ohio Valley? Or Ohio River Valley, excuse me.
Say that again, please.
Do you know if the cicadas have caused any problems for the vineyards here in the Ohio River Valley?
That's a good question. And I have not seen anything because, again, I'm on a couple of things here from various people. Cicadas, as those of us who are here know, what they do is they attack new wood. And it's because the female, they don't eat anything. The female lays its eggs in the new growth. And she does that basically by putting a slit into it. And very often then it will kill the new growth. Oh, that's really interesting from so many different standpoints. We may have to train cicadas because one thing that they do in vineyards is that they actually sort of pinch off the ends of the vines sort of later on where they will do that. But I don't think that because it's a vine, maybe they don't get on those as much as they do trees. That's a great question. And I know a couple people in the wine industry, especially I think of Dr. Gary Gao, who works over at the Pikeville Center. I'm going to send him an email as soon as we finish this up to find out if they're worried at all. But I've seen nothing with anyone putting any kind of netting, because we do net for birds when their things get ripe. But I've seen nothing about that with cicadas. That's a very good question. I don't think it's a problem. I think that they would tend to be on trees because they would know that a tree will be alive for 17 years so they can then munch on it. Because that's what they're doing, of course, is drinking the xylem sap out of the roots for those 17 years. Okay.
Wonderful. I think we can continue on.
Good. Yeah, this is good. Makes me think, which is sort of scary. Again, Australia. Australia is about the fourth largest exporter of wine in the world. Truly amazing. And it also, again, thinking of, it has a long history because, of course, it started as a penal colony, but there was a man by the name of James Busby who brought wines there in the 1820s. By the way, he also brought grapes to New Zealand also in there. The problem, of course, with Australia was it was 10,000 miles away from the rest of Europe. And, of course, it was an English colony. And so the wines that they sent for many, many years were, of course, fortified because of wine that has alcohol added to it can withstand the rigors of a sea voyage, where regular wines basically would turn to nothing after that long at sea. And so it really was not, again, until that whole idea of containerized shipping that, in fact, made Australia's wine industry the behemoth that it is today in all of that. This, of course, is the wine that we're doing, and then we'll talk a little more about Australia. Again, this is Torbreck, which is very interesting. And of course, it's from the Barossa Valley. I'll show you exactly where that is. Barossa is probably one of the most famous wine regions in Australia. I think of Barossa, I think of McLaren Vale, I think of Coonawarra. I mean, these are the names that come to mind when you're talking about the fine wine regions of Australia. And this is certainly one of them. So this is a Torbreck Woodcutters Shiraz. By the way, interestingly enough, Torbreck is actually a forest in Scotland. And so these people, in fact, have Scottish backgrounds. And so, in fact, this idea of having a woodcutter's Shiraz is, in fact, this idea of sort of a big, brawny wine that you would have. In fact, after you've been out there cutting wood the entire time is where the name comes from in this. So it's sort of interesting to see that. Again, look at that color. Dark. Again, still very, very purple. Sort of really nice from that standpoint. And again, if you swirl and smell this wine, and again, it's another one you do not have to put your nose in. Just interesting. In some ways, brighter fruit. It comes out of the nose a bit brighter than the previous wine did. Though it also, very rich. Again, I keep going to, dark fruits, elderberries, blueberries, those kinds of things, blackberries. And really a little bit of again, smokiness or a little bit of lanolin, a little bit of heaviness there. And if you taste this wine, again, the thing I noticed first of all about this wine is its silkiness. It is just so silky. And it's interesting, the dark fruits of the tannins, and the tannins come in later, but it's a little lighter, I think, than the Susana Balboa is from that standpoint, but still, I mean, they're very equivalent in those ways. Actually, this wine, in the finish becomes like, whoa, I mean, sort of a really much bigger in the flavors, and, really brawny in there. Just sort of amazing with that. Beautiful wine. Both of these wines, I think, would be just great barbecue wines because they're not tremendously tannic. And so it's like you're not drinking something that's like super heavy in wintertime or in summertime, etc. Because it has all of that fruit. And they certainly are big. But again, when you think about the stuff that you'd get off the grill, these wines would work very, very well. As you can see, this, of course, is Australia. And all of the wine regions are to the south, which, of course, is because that is the coolest part, in other words, temperature-wise, of everything. From the north, like in Darwin, etc., they can get cyclones, hurricanes in there. And of course, it's very, very dry in the central area in there. This wine is, in fact, from South Australia. As we'll see, in fact, here's a little close-up. Again, you see Barossa, Adelaide Hills, McLaren Vale, Coonawarra. Those are probably, in fact, those areas in South Australia, probably the most important ones. Though I really like the wines from Margaret River, which, as you see, is all the way over in Western Australia there, too. And, of course, Tasmania, because of its coolness, and again, talking about climate change, are also very, very good in there. This is a close-up, in fact, of that. And you can see, of course, very much with the mountains, with the maritime effect that are there. And, of course, there's also the Mount Lofty ranges there. But you see Barossa there in the purple, the darker purple there, not sort of the reddish one there. In there. And so very close and having that maritime effect. Unfortunately for the Australians, they don't have as cold a cold ocean current as they do in California. And so it doesn't do as much of the moderating of the temperatures of this. And heat and dryness, in fact, are two huge problems in Australia today. This, of course, is the winery, the vineyard that I took from there. In fact, and as you can see, there are palm trees. And so it is fairly tropical, certainly in this area. Again, another picture of their vineyards. Very, very modern. As you can see, Torbeck has a very interesting history, too, as the original owner, in fact, and the people sort of changing hands, etc. But they really have done an amazing job in all of this. Here, of course, is the vineyards again. Much of Australia is what we call a riverine system, meaning that they depend on irrigation. Because again, look at the background. It's dry. And even though grapes only need about 15 inches of rain or water a year, obviously need some. And so they don't get as much. And so much of this area, in fact, is irrigated. There is certainly no question about that. 100% Shiraz. Again, they give you the sub-region. You don't need to know that. Again, harvest, of course, is in what our springtime. That is their autumn, 4th of March to April 9th. It was done in 12 months well-seasoned French oak hogshead and foudre, meaning that this wine does not have as much oak aging as the Susana Balboa does. Hogshead, I'm not sure what they mean by size, but it should be larger. And a foudre is actually a very large vat. I mean, probably, about at least 6 or 7 foot tall. Fairly high in alcohol, 14.5, not surprising. pH is moderate. Again, deep garnet, use the purples, dark plum, raspberries, cassis, dark cherry, spice, and vanilla. Medium to full body, soft tannins, texture, mouthfeel. They fill drink now or summer up to 10 years. And again, it talks about, there was no effective, a very hot summer, no rainfall, wind and hail, flowering, followed by 3 major frosts. So they actually had a much smaller harvest with this. So it gave a very concentrated flavors and aroma for the vintage that is this. We got 92 from the wine enthusiast. Again, they say plush, plump, plum. Wow. Alliteration. And cherry accented by flowers, peppery spice, soy, and iron. Palate liver, as the nose suggests, broad-shouldered, as I said, brawny, but neatly cut by fine chalky tannins, lucidity, mineral oak, tangy fruit, and a saline note on the finish. Charming example of modern Barossa Shiraz. This is the editor's choice. Quite the wine. Questions, Ellie?
Yes. So you've talked a lot about oak barrels, but is any other wood used in barrels?
Good question. I would say that probably well over 95% of all barrels, especially when you want to add flavor to a wine, are oak. Now in California, and you will still find some places that are still using redwood. And redwood, of course, but basically, again, for that microoxygenation, not giving flavor, and many of these, in fact, are older. And of course, oak comes from all over the place. Again, probably pride of place, certainly most expensive is French oak. But in fact, a lot of American oak is used in Spain and throughout Europe. And of course, they use a lot of oak from the Balkans also in Spain and other places. The only other wood that I am familiar with that is used in any amount, and this is still a very small amount, is acacia. And that's acacia barrels are used in Bordeaux for some white Bordeaux's. Acacia gives the wine, again, a bit of a perfumed note to it, which can be quite nice. And I remember it's a bit distinctive because I know that I've talked to some winemakers. Again, hopefully we'll be back this year. They typically have a big Bordeaux tasting up in Chicago every January. And so in talking to the winemakers, very often there will be people who will use a small amount of acacia because it does give a lift to the whites, gives them a perfumness that otherwise it would not have. That's the only other oak that I can think of. Of course, there are lots of different kinds of oak. And so here we use white oak here in America. They use 2 or 3 different species in Europe. And so there are a number of different oak species that are used, but oak certainly is by far the major one that is used. Okay. Other questions?
Great. Thank you. Janet from the class of 1979 asks, how did the fires in Australia last year in 2020, how did that affect their wine production?
And I should know more about that. In fact, I do remember now, again, as I think about it, there are some places that in fact were completely destroyed. And the other problem is the fires themselves. What we have found, and unfortunately, of course, both both California and Oregon, of course, have had to deal with this, from 17 and then again 20. Grapevines make great fire breaks because typically, and even though I've seen pictures of worse, typically it may affect or they may burn the first 2 or 3 rows of vines. Obviously still not good, but because the vines are green, they don't carry the fire. And so they make fairly good breaks. The problem is smoke taint. And there are a number of universities and various people, they're spending millions of dollars on trying to figure out when the grapes are susceptible to, in fact, taking in the aromas from the smoke. And it's very interesting, as I mentioned before, one of my former students, again, just simply a good friend now, is assistant winemaker in Oregon. And he has, in fact, promised me when he has some time to send me some smoke-tainted samples, because you read about it all the time, but it's like, well, what does it do? And here he tells me it makes the finish both short, meaning that the wine sort of disappears very quickly, and sort of harsh. And so without it actually tasting or smelling smoky. And so that's really the problem that we're facing. And they're looking at ozone. They're looking at a number of things to hopefully try to mitigate this as much as possible. Plus, of course, just doing everything to try to, of course, mitigate the fire itself so that they don't have to deal with it later. But it is a major, major problem, and one that we will probably unfortunately be facing. The West is currently under a mega drought, and no one sees it changing anytime soon, unfortunately. Anything else?
Yes, one more. Sharon asks, I don't think I've ever seen an official wine rating lower than 85. What part of the scale do they really use, and are they grading on a curve?
That is a wonderful question, and I could not agree more. I very often, again, when I would judge the Cincinnati Wine Festival, we use a 20-point scale. And I'll be honest, they want you, in fact, in many cases, to round up. Again, it was Robert Parker who came up with the 100-point scale, but I've seen occasionally in the 70s, but typically you're right, it's above 80. And so it's like, well, why do we have a 100-point scale if there's nothing below 80? And the problem ends up being, if you look and see how they rate wines, if it is an okay made wine, it probably should get a 75 rating. I mean, it's clean. It should obviously taste at least like the grape. It should hopefully not have a finish or any flaws in it. And so I would say that any basically well-made wine should be an 80, which again, in a 20-point scale would be, probably actually a 12 or 15. Again, when we judge these things, but it's absolutely, you're absolutely correct. Again, but because we're so used to 100% and we're so used to these 100 things, so that's why that's what you see. I mean, even Decanter, for example, they use actually typically 4. In other words, they're 5 stars, but they will very often, they will give you then the point score afterwards because they know that's what people expect. And it's crazy because, the difference that people will allow between a wine that scores an 89 is wine that scores a 90, as though it's something magical. And that's why, for example, the Ontanon, would it score a 90? I don't know. Is that wine delicious? Yes. Would I drink it gladly? Of course. And so this is why, of course, do I look at scores? Of course I look at scores. But do I slavishly follow them? No, because there are several wines that, in fact, are very highly scored that I actively hate, to be honest. And I'm like, seriously? How did anyone give that 95 or 94 points? Because, again, especially Pinot Noirs, and I have a bias against that. Heavy Pinot Noirs over the top are simply not my cup of tea or a glass of wine. So that's just the way it goes. Okay? Anything else?
Yes. So is Shiraz another name for Syrah, and is it the same grape?
Yes, they are actually the same. You have to realize, in fact, and this is another thing that you deal with in the world of wine. There's so much sometimes to deal with in the world of wine. The problem ends up being is, when Syrah, which in fact you're right, is the grape that we call it in practically everywhere else in the world now, when Syrah was taken to Australia, it had any number of names. And even today, very often if you pick up a Spanish bottle of wine, they will tell you that it's made from Tinto Fino. And what is Tinto Fino? Another word for Tempranillo. And so literally you could find that a grape had a different name in the next valley. And it was the same grape, but it just had a different name. And again, there's this wonderful book called, in fact, Wine Grapes. And often you'll find 30, 40, 50 synonyms for grapes. They have all these different names. And so that certainly has been a problem. We've gotten a lot more to do this, but because Syrah, and one of its names was Shiraz, was taken there so early that was the name that, of course, it got in Australia. And so that is what stuck. The other problem, of course, that you find is, again, Pinot Gris, which is the French word for that grape. Pinot Grigio is the Italian word for that grape. And of course, in America, you will find that there are wines made in California that are called Pinot Gris, which tend to be sort of more in the French, sort of more varietally sort of heavy, or Pinot Grigio, which tends to be more lighter, lemony, etc. Nothing wrong, but just a different style. And so they're the exact same grape, the exact same wine, same as Syrah, Shiraz. And that's what you're dealing with. Okay?
Wonderful. I think we can continue on.
Our last wine for this evening is, we're going back, in fact, to California, to Napa Valley, actually to Mount Veeder. And this is the Mount Veeder Winery Cabernet Sauvignon. Again, obviously with a cork. I thought the other wines were dark. This one's dark. But of course, it's Cabernet, not surprisingly. I mean, inky, opaque. There's no question. I mean, you put that to the side and it hardly matters. I mean, you really almost get to the edge and you can sort of see the color, but you can't see that through that wine at all. I mean, it's just like gone. It has tremendous amount of concentration of color in there. Certainly no surprise at all from this wine. And again, if you swirl and smell this wine, and I'll be honest, again, this will come as a surprise. I like wine, and so, but part of it is I really, my first choice, and you can talk to my friends about this, they're probably Pinot Noirs and other wines that are sort of like, a bit sort of lighter and elegant, but this wine is just stunning. I mean, you smell that, just all that redolent of all that wonderful fruit, but also, a dark richness to this wine. And again, you're really not smelling oak, but you're getting those oak characteristics. A little bit of, again, I've used this term in the past, and it goes out to pencil shavings. It reminds me when you take a lead pencil and you sharpen it, it has that aroma to it. And then, of course, black liqueur, which is cassis. This wine has cassis all over it. So beautiful. I always laugh when I think of cassis. I had, a dear friend who, in fact, tried to pour out my cassis one day. I almost killed him. Oh, what a gorgeous wine. And again, if you taste this wine, I haven't even tasted it yet. God. Oh. The thing about this wine, this is obviously a Cabernet, and it is big, but it has an elegance to it. It is not overpoweringly big. And very often when I taste too many Cabernets, it's like coffee, tar, vanilla, coffee, tar, vanilla, coffee, tar, vanilla. I mean, it just goes on and there's nothing. But this has a wonderful, just delicious dark fruit. It has, the tannins are almost, it's a little tarry, but it's almost a little Nebbiolo-like, where you get a little bit of, you can almost feel the tannins on your tongue, which I think is just so interesting. Dark, rich, and it just comes out, that graphite just comes out of this wine. So nice. If you're doing this in a group, you might want to hide this from the rest of the people that are there so you can drink the rest of it later. So good. So good. And then, again, these are the vineyards. It's funny. You cannot find a picture of this winery. In fact, I even wrote Constellation, who, of course, must own it. And he sent me things and was like, okay, that's useless. They own on Mount Veeder. Mount Veeder, of course, is an AVA. I'll show you in a moment. It's a sub-AVA of Napa Valley. It's, of course, up in the mountains, Mount Veeder. And they own a number of different parcels up here where, of course, they blend. And by the way, and I should have noticed this earlier, look how the vineyards are arranged. What you have are, because, again, it's fairly steep, so you have 2 rows and then basically a terrace, and 2 rows and a terrace. Because, again, you can get a tractor actually between those 2 rows and work on it. And then, of course, they keep it sort of clear in between on there. Here's, of course, another picture. And again, you can see, in fact, how these are done on that hillside, almost one by one, but you've got to be able to still get a machinery on there. Also, of course, notice how dry it is. Though Mount Veeder is on the Mayakama side, and so should get a little bit more rain. This again was about the best picture I could see of Napa Valley. And so if you start at the bottom, you see Los Carneros, and then right above it is Mount Veeder. So it's on the Mayakama side. In other words, Sonoma is of course on the other side of the ridge there. And of course, you see all the other areas in it. And of course, the mountain fruit is just absolutely wonderful. Very dry. They have got to irrigate. There's no question in there. In the valley, on the, again, near the river, like in Yountville or Oak Knoll or Rutherford or those other areas, they can drylands farm. You cannot drylands farm in Mount Veeder. They have got to irrigate in those areas. Here's a close-up, in fact, of some of the various wineries that are there. And you can, of course, see the sort of the main part of Napa Valley there to the side. And then, of course, showing you all the various wineries that, in fact, that are up there. Some of them, in fact, very, very important or very famous, like La Coya and Rudd. And, of course, Mount Veeder and Hess Collection and Carol Meredith, Lagunier Meredith, etc. So really some wonderful, wonderful wineries up there in Mount Veeder. Wow. Again, harvested 24 and 26, actually should be September. Grapes, 94% Cabernet Sauvignon, 3% Malbec, 3% Merlot. Interestingly enough, this wine did a pre-fermentation cold soak, meaning that they took the grapes and they kept them cold and they simply allowed the grapes to soak in the juice, they were crushed, so that they could get some certain flavors or aroma compounds out of the grapes before fermentation take place. You can see to enhance color and body. Fermentation and maceration for 22 days. Again, not quite as long as we had seen on one of the previous wines to build structure and integrate mouthfeel. pH, again, 3.5, TA 5.9, alcohol 14.5. They make only 7,900 cases of this wine for this. And again, 95 points. I think it's a tasting tape. Blueberry, chocolate aromas, flavors, full-bodied brown tannins, blue fruit, walnuts, crushed stones, finished, flavorful, yet not overdone. James Suckley gave it 93. Plum fruit, toasty elements, impressive depth, bright fruit structure. Anthony Diaz Blue, again, 92. Wine Advocate, which of course is Parker. Deep purple garnet, which it is, sings with warm black currants, black cherries, mulberries, fragrances of chocolate box, lilacs, and licorice. Being to full body, laden with energetic, crunchy black fruit flavors, framed by ripe, fine, great tans, and loads of freshness. Finishing long and perfumed. What a bargain price for this classic Napa Cab beauty. Literally, you could put this wine against wines that are 2 or 3 times its price. A beautiful, beautiful wine. Okay. Questions, Ellie?
Yes. So Evan from the class of 2007 asked, the West Coast wines gets a lot of attention in the United States, and rightfully so, but are there any North American regions east of the Mississippi that you are following?
Again, it comes as a surprise because California makes like 86% of all the wine that's made in the United States. And of course, it's then followed by Washington State and Oregon. And so they really are sort of the big three. But you really, Virginia is making some very nice wines, and certainly look for those. When you say sort of east of Mississippi, my go-to place right away is New York. I mean, the Finger Lakes especially, A, they're absolutely beautiful. B, they're making, and I'm not exaggerating, world-class Rieslings and Pinot Noirs. Some of those wines are absolutely amazing. And it's just a great place to visit. I mean, just so much fun and so beautiful. It really is. If you've not been to the Finger Lakes, you need to go. Not, just because it's beautiful. I mean, the wine, the food, the Corning Museum. I mean, all kinds of things, in fact, to do there in central New York. It really, really is beautiful in the summertime. Well, probably any time. But it really is quite the place. And so very, very nice. Virginia wine country is beautiful. And they make really nice wines, especially Cabernet Francs, also Viogniers, that are really nice. And of course, Linden Vineyards. We have a Miami alum who, in fact, owns a winery in Virginia. So go visit Linden Vineyards. It's just gorgeous, and his wines are delicious. He's almost considered one of the fathers of Virginia wines now, which is truly amazing. Otherwise, again, Northern Ohio makes some really good wines, and I enjoy going there and tasting the wines, etc. So it really is. There's lots of good places, but those, at least right at the top of my head, that are the places that I would certainly go and enjoy.
That's wonderful. Thank you. A viewer on YouTube asked, they saw a label that had unfiltered and unrefined. Is that unusual to have on a label? They have never seen it before.
Good, and I'm glad they noticed that. It's another one of those things where, again, filtration can take away flavors and aroma, and so you want to filter as little as possible, and everyone does. Fining is actually using, for the most part, people use clay, where you don't want to look at a wine and say, oh, there's stuff floating in my wine. You don't want that. And so consequently, you will fine the wines, especially whites, obviously. In other words, you actually put a material in the wine, and very often it has been egg whites. It has been calcined clay, bentonite, a number of other things have been used. And what happens is you make a slurry and you put it in the top, and of course it floats down through the wine. Well, it has a charge. And so what it does is it picks up the particulate matter, so it cleans up the wine. It fines the wine. That's what fining means in there. And in many cases, you can do that so that you don't. Or otherwise, what they do also to get rid of a lot of the crap, lees is what we call it. In other words, it's the gunk that's on the bottom of the barrel. What we do is we rack, meaning we move it from one barrel to another, and we do it delicately so we don't bring any of the crap with us. And so if you can do that well enough so you can have a clean wine, it is unfiltered and unfined, meaning that they're basically saying you are getting all of the flavors and aromas of that wine, which in itself is good. Having said that, it can still be crap wine, but it's unfiltered and unfined. And so it's not an absolute seal of approval, shall we say, to that wine, but it does show you that this person, in fact, took real good care or did this wine in that manner. And so they're very often very proud. And so you will see that not a whole lot, but fairly often on bottles where they will say specifically unfiltered, unfined. Never on a white. I don't think I've ever seen that on a bottle of white wine, but you will find it on reds occasionally. So yeah, good question.
Great, thank you. And I think we have one last question I think will be a great one to end on from Terry from the class of 1973. He asks, how did you learn to dissect the different flavors in the wine? Or how do you learn as a novice?
Practice. Really, I mean, and it's really interesting because for one thing, listen to your nose. I know that sounds strange, but it is funny, how, and it's like with everything. It's like with all of our senses. I'm sure you've all seen the one video where they tell you to follow the bouncing ball and the bear goes through the video and you never notice the bear is there. And that's because we tend to really concentrate, when we do these kinds of things. And so that's why, in fact, we have found that, that eyewitnesses are terrible because they really don't see the entire picture. And I think we tend to, because we've never learned to, ignore what our nose is telling us. And this is why basically, in fact, in many cases, women from a genetic standpoint and also from a learning standpoint are better at these things. But it is, and I have to laugh, even at this late date. I mean, I think it was yesterday or today. I was cooking something, and of course I was walking by, and of course I always get sidetracked. And it's like, And all of a sudden my nose will tell me, whoa, you didn't check on that, and so it's paying attention with your nose to what you're smelling. And again, that doesn't mean, again, because people would look at you very funny if you went through Kroger's and like kept picking things up and smelling them. But if you smell things and then have a visual picture of what you're at the same time of what you're smelling, very often you can go back then and figure out, or the next time you have that aroma, then the picture will jump up into your mind. And so that's what it is. Also, again, when it comes to wines, go to tastings, talk to people, listen to what I'm spouting, and all that kind of stuff will also make a huge difference in all of this, in doing that. And so that really, unfortunately, I wish there was an easy answer. Of course, you can buy, the French have what is called nez de vin, where you can buy the various aromas. And so you can try to use that to try to figure out what you are smelling. Because for the most part, one of the things I do in my class, in fact, is I actually take a base wine and I will put aromas in the wine. And then I have the students work in groups to try to figure out what they're smelling, because they've never done that before. They've never had to think about really what they are smelling. You see a lemon, it smells like lemons. You see a blueberry, it smells like blueberries. You see, exhaust, it smells like exhaust. And so, but we don't think about those aromas as separate entities, I think, in some ways. And so I think that's what it takes, sort of with everything else in there. Okay. Anything else?
No, I think that is it.
Okay. Pictures for you. I'm sure none of you spent any time at all at Brick Street. But in fact, this is the work that was going on this morning. They're putting up a top deck onto Brick Street. And so this is what it looked like this morning. So the next time you come back to Oxford, you can actually probably be up on the top deck at Brick Street. And of course, this is a picture I took uptown. You can come back. Of course, when you were here, there was probably not graders. And so, of course, there is graders there and everything else there on High Street, UDF, et cetera, of course, looking that way to the west in there. And finally, again, those of you who probably, in fact, possibly were in Ox College as a dormitory. This, of course, is now the OCAC, the Oxford Community Arts Center, and they have built a lovely garden in the back. And this is the picture of that lovely garden this morning also. So again, thank you for attention. Thank you, and have a great Miami University Alumni Weekend.
Thank you so much.
I'm done.
Thank you so much, Jack, for everything. As always, it's such a wonderful tasting. And I hope all of you alumni, I hope you all join us as Alumni Weekend continues on tomorrow. Our first session is at 9 a.m. Eastern, with a spotlight on the Miami University John Dalboy European Center in Luxembourg, because obviously the time difference, we had to do it quite earlier in the morning. So I hope you're able to join us for that. And on behalf of the entire Alumni Association, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful evening.